To introduce Stevan Weine. He's Professor for Psychiatry and Director of the International Center of Responses to Catastrophes at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And Weine is author of two books, When History is a Nightmare, Lives and Memories of Ethnic Cleansing in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Testimony and Catastrophe, Narrating the Traumas of Political Violence. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Zohar and Michelle, for inviting me to this wonderful conference. Thanks for your attention after lunch on a beautiful afternoon. I hope it's worth it. In New Haven in 1992, Dorian Laub and I began collecting testimonies of men and women and children who came from Omarska concentration camp in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I continued to gather many testimonies in the U.S. and in Croatia and in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and that became the first book mentioned. And then thought a lot about testimony in different historical spaces, and did so from the point of view of the literary theory of Mikhail Bakhtin, which Michelle mentioned earlier, which I felt was a necessary antidote to a lot of the psychological theory that had framed testimony. And I'll refer to that a little bit today. And the journey continued and became a program of research on migration and refugees, and much of which concerned people who are Muslim, who are living in the U.S. And that led into the area of homegrown terrorism, which is what I'm going to talk about today, an area in which concerns about narration and testimony and trauma have very important national, U.S. national, and multinational policy implications, which I hope to touch on. So let's begin with three kind of snippets of stories. One young Kuwaiti man was released from Guantanamo Bay, went to Mosul, and became a suicide bomber. He was given a surname, given a website, and there was a magazine article published about him. And on the website he says, "I thank Allah who freed me from Guantanamo Bay prison, and after we were tortured, connected me with the Islamic State of Iraq. You may not see us again after this meeting because we are headed for Allah, and Allah willing, we will enter the dens and the neighborhoods of those who have abandoned Islam." At the Saudi Rehabilitation Center in Riyadh, a couple of years ago, we heard from men who had become jihadis in Iraq, and they all said they were responding to the quote-unquote massacre of innocents, which they had witnessed on television or the internet from the U.S. aerial bombing of Iraq. The phrase massacre of innocents is repeated again and again, and I'm not sure whether they knew the reference from the Gospel of Matthew, referring to King Herod's committing infanticide in Bethlehem. Another vignette, Omar Hamami, the famous American jihadi, left Alabama and went to join al-Shabaab in Somalia. He became al-Amriki, the American, and he made a recruitment video which is famous. You can watch it on the web. It was released in 2009. And it combines battle scenes and biblical teachings and even, religious teachings and even rapping by al-Amriki. And he says, "The only reason we are staying here, away from our families, away from the cities, away from candy bars and all these other things, is because we're waiting to meet with the enemy. If you can encourage more of your children and more of your neighbors and anyone around you to send people to this jihad, it would be a great asset for us." So each of these brief samples reflects an effort to lend support to violent extremism by telling stories which incorporate traumatic experiences from political violence. And in some ways, these stories resemble testimonies. And by now, everybody here, I'm sure, is familiar with the so-called global jihadist narrative that frames these stories. And terrorism experts are pouring through these narratives and stories and trying to understand what it is that makes them so powerful that gets people to commit acts of terrorism. So the purpose of this paper is to advance our understanding of the role of narrative in terrorism and counterterrorism by reflecting some on trauma testimony discourses. And I have three main arguments. First, I'm going to argue that The narratives that are produced by terrorists should be considered poisonous utilitarian testimonies. Second, I argue that by responding to the utilitarianism of terrorist testimonies, for example, by producing utilitarian counter-narratives, this could hamper our effort to combat terrorism in the U.S. and other places. Third, I want to suggest that, I guess this is a popular time, there's seats up front. You don't have to all squeeze in the back. So I suggest that what's called for is for what we call primary prevention of terrorism, say in U.S. Muslim diasporas. It requires a paradigm shift towards a dialogic approach of partnership and mutual responsibility, listening as well as speaking, incorporating multiple voices from families and communities. Okay, now to speak of narrative components. Now, terrorism experts, I've read everything I could find on terrorism experts who are looking at these narratives of testimonies, and they often tend to break down the narrative into different component parts. One scholar, Tom Quiggin, described these three parts, or four parts. One, Muslims around the world are being attacked by the U.S. and Western allies. 2, jihadis are defending Muslims against this attack. 3, in defending Muslims, they are justified in using violence. And 4, all good Muslims should support these actions. Another scholar, William Casper, identified other key elements of the terrorist message. A story of impending doom, moral outrage, simplicity, climax, authenticity. Another scholar, Michael Vlahos, focused on myth creation, and he identified elements like heroic journey, mythic time, myth creation. Now, my perspective on reading these is that reducing narratives to a list of components doesn't justify the narratives, especially narratives that you claim to be so powerful. Doesn't understanding a narrative require a narrative? And I think it does. I think it requires us to dig deeper into such questions as how do terrorist stories relate to other established narrative genres, including ones we've been talking about here, and the testimony of survivors of political violence, as I've come to know it. And how do terrorist stories work as stories, motivating people to engage in or support terrorist activities? So the question I come to now is it testimony? So what kinds of stories regarding trauma, what kinds of trauma does the AQ narrative tell? A first step would be to identify different categories of stories that terrorists tell that could include trauma. And some categories could be the recruitment story, the completed suicide terrorist story, the failed or aborted suicide terrorist story, the organizational leader's story, the terrorist combatant story, the terrorist family member's story. Now, each would require a very thoughtful description and unpacking, and I obviously can't do that here. But I want to make a few general points. There are several ways in which you could say right away that these stories don't resemble a typical survivor's testimony story. One, the person is usually speaking of the suffering of other Muslims. They're not speaking of their own suffering. 2, the story tends to be very brief, restrained, closed, and there's no place for surprise, for discovery, for catharsis. 3, these stories speak of the present or recent past, usually, and not the distant past. 4, the principal intent of the story is to justify and inspire future acts of violence, or as they might say, resistance. In these ways, they don't seem like testimonies, do they? And yet they do share certain characteristics with testimonies. They both bear witness to acts of political violence. They both want to document historical truths. They both want to affect what I call cultural change, maybe what someone else called ethical change. They both express the hope that the telling of the story will lead to a better day. And they both allow their story to conform to a given testimony genre. And my study of testimony across several genres has concluded that the professionals and managers and disciplines that receive testimonies and try to use them to help survivors often regard them very instrumentally and approach them very instrumentally. From this perspective, the stories told by terrorists could be the ultimate utilitarian testimonies. but they're also poisonous in that they have the explicit intention of getting people to commit violent acts. These stories deliberately draw upon the spectacle of violent and traumatic events, either personal traumas, family traumas, historical traumas, community traumas, or cultural traumas, so as to provoke emotional intensity and moral outrage to get people to do big things. I think bigger things than ideology itself can supply. Of course, it always helps when the person who's telling the story is a terrorist combatant themselves, one who has experience, and not just a bystander. And I think the Internet has proven to be an outstanding medium for the communication of these stories, often with images and with music. And over time, these have become much more sophisticated productions than they were before. And these appeal very much to Muslim men and the young men in the diaspora who have more in common with MTV than mosques. Now, terrorist testimonies are not the only utilitarian testimonies. And I think I don't need to say it here so much, but although testimony is spoken by an individual, we recognize that it's part of a genre in many respects. And even more than that, as some people have alluded to, it's often shaped by managers and professionals who ask the story to be told in a certain kind of way. In fact, in this book, Testimony After Catastrophe, I've argued that that these kind of attempts to kind of manhandle testimony, I think, take away from the strength and power of testimony, I think, which lies most in its being a polyphonic, dialogic, and unfinalizable narrative, as unpredictable and unmanageable as that is. And this is the way that I was thinking about testimony as I approached this issue of narrative and counter-narrative in testimony. So that brings me to the issue of the failed counter-narrative of the war on terrorism. Amongst U.S. policymakers and pundits and terrorism experts, a very antithetical idea has prevailed to my idea of what testimony should be, and that idea is that they have their narrative, God damn it, we should have ours too. And we should shape our narrative, and it should be as strong and as single-minded and as focused as theirs. And nowadays, so it's easy to kind of see the flaws in this, but the Bush administration, actively promoted its war on terrorism and the narratives that went along with that, which are now widely seen as escalated the conflict and widened the divide. And it's easy to see why, because it was really a narrative of aggression, not compassion, that it pretended that only one global counter-narrative is needed. You don't need to speak to different communities, different countries. It used the wrong terminology, like crusade. It used the wrong messengers, like Donald Rumsfeld. It was often contradictory to policy positions, like the disastrous war in Iraq. And it didn't adequately acknowledge the victims of terrorism, especially Muslim victims, let alone the hopes and successes and aspirations of ordinary Muslim families and communities in the U.S. So it's tempting to believe that now we see the light and we don't fall into those mistakes, and yet there are current calls for, I think, similarly questionable efforts. One is the efforts to produce counter-narratives that somehow undo the magic of these narratives by, for example, humiliating the terrorists, by demasculating them, by insulting them. And another example that has gotten a lot of attention recently by Peter Bergen, the journalist and television personality, who says the Achilles heel is to reveal that terrorist attempts kill innocent Muslims, and that we should be telling those kinds of stories. My principal concern is that these may end up being as short-sighted as the war on terrorism kinds of narrative, in particular because they are not dialogic. They're not listening to, or they're not produced with any mindset of listening to or in collaboration with Muslim communities and families. They don't speak to their everyday fears and aspirations. And I think that would be crucial to speaking to people in Muslim diasporas in the U.S. Who are bothered both by the sense of not being real Americans and not being real Muslims like those in their countries of origin. I know these are terrible generalizations, but we'll have to live with them in such a short time. So now I move on to the search for a pro-social counter-narrative. There have been many calls for new directions in counter-narratives that reflect more engagement with Muslim communities and even nations. And of course, this was signaled by Barack Obama's lecture in Cairo in 2009. The UN Symposium on Supporting Victims of Terrorism has a priority which includes, quote, put a human face on the personal tragedies suffered by victims of terrorism. Along these lines, Salufu and Kumaj recommended, quote, portraying the real victims of terrorism as the true murderers. And they suggest that the U.S. government, along with social networking sites, tell 1,000 stories about people who've been killed, especially Muslim people who've been killed through terrorism, and get that out there. Now, as the Obama administration seeks to engage Muslims and promote more mainstream voices to speak out, no major new policy directions are apparent along these lines, except for one, which is the effort to apply community policing, which has worked very well in the U.S. to combat, say, criminal gangs, gang violence, to apply that kind of thing to Muslim diaspora communities and counterterrorism. And I think that's good in the sense of fostering partnership and all that, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. It stops way short of the kinds of telling and listening to trauma testimonies that we're talking about. To go deeper, we have to think more about concepts of the narrative. So I wondered, what kind of concepts of the narrative are people talking about in trauma, in the terrorism field? Many terrorism experts just share an explicit belief that the narrative is important, and they cite the counterinsurgency field manual, which says, quote, the central mechanism through which ideologies are expressed and absorbed is the narrative. A narrative is an organizational scheme expressed in story form. But yet, as this quote itself indicates, I think that the idea of what is a narrative is just highly, highly underdeveloped. Here are the kinds of theories that are mentioned in this writing. They mention Gustav Freytag's concept of the triangle. They mention the idea of thinking is organized as stories by some cognitive psychologist. They mention Aristotle's concept of ethos, logos, and pathos. I think what these theories lack is what everybody here knows and has been talking about the last couple days, which is a recognition that these stories are at least in part trauma stories, trauma testimony discourses. And what they also lack is a way to situate these narratives in the context of social relations, social communications, and political action. So I think thus these theories offer really very little hope for countering the already strong monologic tendency that I think is inherent in testimony, and that counter-narratives and counterterrorism are at risk of embodying. Some people who've drawn less upon narrative therapy and more upon radicalization therapy have done better. One example is the work of Leprecht et al., who have said, well, there's no one path to terrorism, to radicalization, to terrorism, so therefore there can't be any one counter-narrative. And so they've broken it down into 3 different counter-narratives, and they talk about the necessity of tailoring counter-narratives for different phases, different audience, different cultures. This makes a lot of sense to me, but I think we need to go further. For me, I turn to Bakhtin. Bakhtin described dialogic work, which I think everybody here knows what dialogic work means, but I'll say a few words. We're talking about responsible and active discourse involving the dynamic interactivity of multiple voices and points of view. So one point of view is always shaped by another, and its connection to other points of view, and they're all held together in a dialogic relation. And I think that's true when applied to trauma and testimony. My view of testimony is it's many kinds of stories told for multiple purposes in different contexts towards different ends. And that testimonies convey a great power, a narrative power, with respect to trauma, in part by embodying this dialogic principle, by enabling multiple voices and positions to speak and listen to one another openly and responsibly, by respecting and conveying the unfinalizability of trauma, which includes survivors' hopes and even imagined futures, as someone was alluding to before. Testimonies generate new speech genres which have potential to engage readers or listeners in dialogue, and they can be transformative with respect to documenting truth or changing culture or building or affirming communities. So what if instead of using testimonies for countering or firing back, what if we instead took as a starting point active dialogic understanding, by which Bakhtin means inclusion in the dialogic context, so the living utterance of a particular historical moment in a socially specific environment, to enter into social dialogue. Well, I've been using these kinds of ideas in one particular community, the Somali American community in Minnesota, which is the largest number of East Africans outside of East Africa, and the place where 20 young boys and young men went to work with al-Shabaab in Somalia, and one of them became the first U.S. suicide bomber. So for the last part of my talk, I'm just going to speak a little bit about that work. So I'm conducting a formal ethnography of these Somali Americans in Minnesota that's collaborative with members of that community, and which is funded by the U.S. government. So there we have Generation 1.5 Somali Americans who were born in Somalia, raised in refugee camps in Kenya, and then came to the U.S. When they were young or even in their teenage years, and lived in a highly ghettoized part of Minneapolis called the Cedar Riverside area, many of them in this building called the Towers. And because their parents brought them when they were so young, many of them don't have actual memories of the war, but many of them lost family members, and they see the human consequences of the destruction of the war. They're exposed to a lot of violence in their community, including a lot of gang violence. And they hear the stories, and they especially watch everything on YouTube about what continues to happen in Somalia. But their parents, who are forward-looking, forward-thinking, don't want them to think about the war, and so they don't really talk much about that at home. Little opportunity for dialogue with parents or elders, and I mean elders like community elders, about the war, about extremism, about what it meant for them. So I wondered, did this combination of excess of images and absence of full articulation create fertile ground for extremists to sell their message through stories combined with ideology? And I believe yes in four senses. One, that youth in our ethnography have reported a hunger for stories about the war that their parents did not satisfy, but which extremists could. Two, youth report a lack of understanding about what war in the failed state of Somalia really looks like. Three, youth and parents report a lack of consideration about how to support and guide boys and young men in the diaspora, in the U.S., during a time of extremism and in an environment of what I call ghettoization. And also the parents report a kind of blind faith in the local mosques to shepherd the development of the youth. At least they're off the street. If they're in the mosque, I can feel good that they're being taken care of. Now, all of this made it very easy for a small number of former fighters to come to tell engaging stories to these youth about the war in Somalia, and to get 20 boys and young men to go to Somalia without telling their parents. And I want to emphasize, they were not losers. They were the best and brightest in their communities. They were straight-A students, pre-med students, pre-engineering students, president of the Somali Association, really outstanding kids. Subsequently, the community has been saturated with stories. So in come the journalists who tell stories about the youth ad nauseum, the most talented ones very well. But from the perspectives of family and community, every story about Somali Americans is at best highly biased, and exoticized, and at worst, openly discriminatory. Several community advocates have started to tell the story, some given testimony in front of Congress. One young woman has made a film that was just premiered last week in Minneapolis. The community is highly divided, and what we're finding in our ethnography, and someday I'll be able to report on in detail, is discourses of rebellion against Al-Shabaab and against the mosque, discourses of solidarity with the main mosque, discourses of disavowal, which says we are removed from all key processes. We had nothing to do with this. Discourses of warriors, the Somali warrior tradition, which is part of the culture of young men, and discourses of fatalism, made worse by another story. In the wake of this, there was a sex trafficking scandal where Somali criminal gangs were found to be taking young women and sending them out of state to do prostitution. Now, saturating all of this is the FBI. The FBI is highly present. They're doing investigation. They have many informants. They're gathering intelligence. Periodically, they hold town meetings. They've done a good job at doing what they do. But their task is mostly to do criminal investigation and prosecution. And recently, you might have heard there's a story in Portland about a sting operation that was taken against a young man whose father turned him in because of suspicions. And then the FBI did a sting operation on him, and he was going to detonate a bomb on Christmas in Portland, Oregon. A trial is anticipated where federal government agents will produce the kind of testimony that criminal trials allow. But the underlying conditions in the community have not changed. It's believed that a large number of youth were exposed to these recruiters or to radical teachings and have not yet mobilized and are still out there. And there has been no known effort by the government or by NGOs to reach these kids, to talk to them, or to work with community organizations to do anything at a level which involves working with youth around these issues. So the last thing I want to say is what would be some starting points for new policies. I think that in addition to intelligence gathering and criminal investigation, which of course are necessary priorities, I think what's called for is a primary prevention of terrorism. But I think it requires a paradigm shift towards a dialogic approach of partnership and mutual responsibility. As I said before, listening as well as speaking, incorporating multiple voices from families and communities. So this could take several forms, none of which are maybe what Dory called the other day real testimony, but I think all of which could draw upon an approach to testimony as a polyphonic, dialogic, unfinalizable narrative in a social communication sense that we've been talking about. So one, I think it's very important in communities like this, in this community and others, to support ethnographic research that investigates actually how diaspora youth and adults, women and men, are talking about war, extremism, grievances, homeland, Islam, growing up, so as to explore, what ways of understanding self, family, community, nation, and citizenship make these recruiters' narratives so compelling, and what other kinds of narratives need to be produced, such as the kind of work Carol talked about yesterday, that kind of sensitive, detailed work, and work that we're trying to do too. I believe that ultimately the best protection against this kind of radicalization is parents and families. And so we need to support parents and families. So we need parent support and education interventions that help parents how to talk with their kids about growing up in this triad of extremism, ghettoization, and failed state. We neglect refugee parents in the United States. We don't do enough for them, for sure. And they need help along these areas. The other would be to promote community dialogue on growing up amidst this terrible triad of things through what might be called a public conversation approach. Now, but instead of organizing it around terrorism and testimony, I think why not organize it around something like Tariq Ramadan's narrative of Muslims' prideful belonging in the West. To borrow someone else's terminology from earlier today, this is affirming an alternative future reality. That this is our place. We belong here. We're good Americans, and we're good Muslims, and here's how we're going to do it. So why not affirm that? I think this, more than trauma, would spark conversations and stories that would reflect on Somali Americans and help them to deepen their engagement in the U.S. liberal democracy. This could take many forms: building knowledge and skills of families, of endogenous cultural brokers, not Americans, not white Americans like me, but people from that community, building online sites to create resources for youth, parents, helpers to promote dialogue. Okay, you get the idea. So in conclusion, the terrorist narrative, in part resting on poisonous utilitarian trauma testimonies, should be countered not with utilitarian testimony, but with efforts that aim to broaden and deepen social dialogue on difficult topics in hard times. Because if family and community members don't learn to adapt and to find new ways to listen and to speak with youth about failed state, about extremism, about ghettoization, then recruiters coming equipped with poisonous stories are going to meet little resistance. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Weine. You really gave us food for thought with this interesting and new twist to the term testimony. I think we do have to ask now questions because it's really interesting and exciting, and the audience can ask now if there are no questions.
Well, I can speak up if you want.
We got a microphone. We got a microphone here.
First of all, thank you very much. It's more of a comment, but if it's a question, you can answer it as a question. But the way you describe the manhandling of trauma testimonies for utilitarian, in a poisonous way, for utilitarian purposes, the way you described it, for me rang true with movements that wouldn't necessarily be considered, as part of my research about soldier trauma testimony, movements that wouldn't necessarily be considered prone to aggression, such as anti-war movements, very dogmatic anti-war movements that I feel could potentially circumvent dialogue in the same way and use testimonies in order to make a point that testimonies don't always necessarily make, which is just a point I wanted to make and ask you what you felt about that.
Should we take more? Okay. Well, I agree. I mean, I would distinguish between, benevolent and poisonous utilitarian uses. I think that we're afraid of those stories. We're afraid of those stories. Even the do-gooders, the clinicians, the therapists, the human rights activists, the lawyers, are afraid of those stories. If we really, because if they get out of control, then we can't contain them and we can't manage them. There's a lot that threatens us there. So we work very hard to not let them be the stories that they could be. We accomplish many important short-term gains, and I'm not discounting those. And in some ways it could be healing. In some ways it's necessary in a legal testimony. But I think we also lose something. And I'm not saying that. So I'm not saying to throw all that out. But I am trying to rethink that.
What you're calling for sounds really interesting and in some sense persuasive for a kind of dialogue, a dialogic model which would not be one of conversion or deprogramming or switching from one narrative to another narrative. And it's not even switching from, let's say, the jihadi narrative to then the becoming American narrative, but asking for dialogue. And what I'm wondering, though, is my view of American society is that it is not doesn't have too many successful models of good political dialogues or even social dialogues at this point. In fact, we're at a moment where it seems that's kind of like fractured as an ideal. So 2 questions. One is, what are some models that you see as kind of well-functioning ones that could be used here in terms of dialogue? And the other is, who are the partners or the kind of possible partners for dialogue? And you did mention several of that in terms of moving from the family into others, but I'm still having some difficulty imagining who the other partners or participants would be in dialogue. And the kind of third part of that is thinking, particularly in relation to Bakhtin, and his notion of polyphony is often then actually internal multi-voices. That one character has itself multi-voices, and I was wondering whether you're seeing that as, in some sense, the kind of goal or ideal here, or I'd just like to hear more about that also.
I think my question has a little bit of a connection with that, and
It was fascinating, Steve. Thank you. I wanted to ask the question that connects with that is that because America has been such a central power in the world, I think that compared to other countries, there hasn't always been a kind of open deconstruction of American myths and narratives. So that the question is, if the American identity and citizenship is the alternative for these people, so maybe one option would be to kind of explore how they can enter into that narrative. Where is that narrative today as opposed to 20, 30, 50 years ago? And also, there's been some work on alternative narratives or alternative biographies, so that these people seem to have a choice of going, to become fighters, and what do you do with that kind of choice? So it's either enter the American myth or do something ideologically profound as a Muslim, and so it's that kind of tension.
Thank you very much. Is there a possibility also to develop a kind of thinking of critique for those people so they can differentiate what poisonous narratives are and what aren't? In other words, not to necessarily suggest an alternative narrative, but to have them, deep thinking of how to criticize, how to differentiate those narratives.
These are all very thoughtful questions. I appreciate it, and I'll be thinking about them for a long time. I think I'm not sure what I know. I can't do justice to them in my response now, but I'll say a few things. One, there are models. I mean, the best models are that there are a lot of success stories in the Somali American community. There are doctors and lawyers and university people and academics. There are a lot of success, police officers, and we don't do enough to help their stories be told, to amplify their stories in the community. That's one thing. Another thing is that the U.S. government knows that its model is inadequate. It knows that its model is inadequate. There's a lot to be said here, but first, the whole model of refugee assimilation is just based on economic integration, that you achieve economic self-sufficiency as soon as possible, and then you're an American. And we don't try to manage really the cultural integration of new Americans, except through ESL, English as a second language. I would contrast that with the cultural policies in the EU and in UK. And so there's the famous UK Prevent program, which is a huge psychosocial program to try to basically in some ways, promote the social integration of Muslims. But in the UK, it's mostly Pakistanis. In the US, it's too many different populations, so no one model would fit. The other thing is the U.S. has a very political problem because of our Constitution. The U.S. government is very loath to get involved in managing the radical ideas in a community. So the FBI works on stopping violent radicalization. So the line is drawn on, are you going to commit a crime? The government does not want to get involved with that. So, but that's changing. That's changing. And so I think that, in some ways, I'm a guy who's been involved in refugee work for 20 years, since the time with Dory, when Dory and I started doing that together. There are a lot of holes and inadequacies in our refugee system, and I think in some ways the recruiters have found a way to point right on these inadequacies. So I think it's going to make us ask questions about our whole system of promoting acculturation, of an adjustment of refugees and immigrants. And I think that would be a good thing. Just in the same way that preparation for terrorism events has forced us to look at our public health system, which is inadequate in many ways. So I think that I shouldn't keep going. I'll think about those comments, and maybe we can catch up individually on the other ones. Thanks for your thoughts. I'll say while they're shifting, Jeff, if a young Somali man wants to do something for his country, there aren't many ways to be a warrior of peace. You can't come to Israel, and it's not like you can come to Israel and be in a kibbutz or be some kind of a soldier in that community. So, but there are models like that, and there are models of mentoring that could be used.